Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second Fresh Perspectives panel in the 2021-2022 TLL Speaker Series. We're really happy that you're here. We had a fabulous discussion last week, and personally, I'm looking forward to learning more from this week's panelists. Before we jump into today's session, I wanted to let you all about the next Speaker Series event coming up on October 26th from 3 to 4. And in that session, Dr. Mays Ahmad, a Garner Institute Fellow and an AAC&U Senior Fellow in the Office of Undergraduate STEM Education, will talk to us about trauma-informed pedagogy and how the neuroscience of toxic stress can and should inform our classroom teaching practices. So please mark your calendars and tell your colleagues. Some background info for today's presentation about the logistics and how it came to be. In the spring of 2021, Ryan McDowell, who's organized this event, and Kate Weishar in OVC, conducted a series of 13 interviews with MIT faculty and instructors about their remote teaching experiences in the past year. And we wanted to learn more about strategies and goals for student learning, and in particular, what they learned and what they were hoping to carry forward into future semesters. We know that the teaching and learning this past year has been difficult and at times painful, and we want to acknowledge that while appreciating the fresh perspectives afforded and I'd say required by teaching through the pandemic. We'll be publishing those videos on the TLL website, all those interviews throughout the fall, and we're interested in hearing and documenting more stories. So if you have your own stories to share or you know of stories from the teaching community, please contact us. So today we're extremely happy to bring together Professor Michael Short, Dr. Bruno Verdini, Dr. Dimitra Dimitrakopoulou, and Dr. Rea Lavi. And they will be talking about what they did during the pandemic, during their remote teaching experiences, and what they hope to bring forward into the future. In addition, I want to introduce Marcia Dunn, who is a graphic facilitator. And if you were at last week's session or you clicked on the link in the chat, you know about Marcia's work. She'll be visually capturing in real time the ideas of the discussion during the discussion today. We'll spotlight Marcia's work periodically throughout the panel presentation. I've participated in several events that Marcia has facilitated, and I can say that her work adds a new and important dimension to the fabric of the discussion. And her completed work from last week's panel is linked in the chat and is available on our website. So in terms of structure, the panelists will each share their reflections to the discussion prompts, these first 3 discussion prompts. Right, there we go, these first 3 discussion prompts, and followed by a break for questions after all 4 presenters have shared. But please feel free to post your questions in the chat, and we will either aggregate them and ask them collectively, or we may try to address them in the chat, depending. And then we will ask the panelists to share the responses to the final question about what they're doing now and what they're looking forward to. So now I'd like to start with the real meat of the day and ask Professor Mike Short to kick us off.
Sure, thanks, Janet. Thanks everyone for coming today. So when the pandemic hit, I was challenged with teaching Intro to Nuclear Physics in a very different setting, in a class that usually required a lot of face-to-face instruction, a lot of personalized instruction, a lot of office hours, and they're not easy concepts. This is the course where students go from solving closed form problems in the General Institute requirements of GIRs to solving open-ended problems, confronting the idea that mass is another form of energy. We all see E = mc² on t-shirts and everything in science culture, but we don't really understand it that well. And it's hard enough in a normal year, as I'm still finding this year. Doing so remotely looked to be exceedingly difficult. And I needed a way to replicate the MIT Blackboard experience remotely. Now, this is hard to do because we weren't all together. And a lot of people really stepped up in terms of creating new materials, demoing lots of new tech to do this kind of stuff, being very empathetic with the students' plights of having to study remote. But as I started going through the options of what was available, from teaching at a whiteboard to camera at a blackboard to using an iPad to GoodNotes to anything else, I found that nothing even came close to what I would call an MIT experience. And I'd seen a lot of debates in the open literature and in popular news about how higher education, what's the value in it? If we could just watch some lectures on YouTube, I mean, what are you really getting? And it dawned on me then it was the interaction. It was the ability for students to get their questions answered their way by the experts who are going to spend their time making sure that they get it. So in order to remedy this, I took a page from Jim Kane in Office of Digital Learning and converted my office into a lightboard studio. Now, Jim and a few others had already done things like this, where you could pre-record lectures on this lightboard right here, which is it's a low iron glass that allows you to write as if it were a blackboard. The one question I always get is, did I write backwards? The answer is no. I have a little box on the floor that flips the horizontal video feed. But it allows you to sit behind the lightboard and write as if it were a blackboard and then stare at the students in the camera. What you don't see off screen is I had a big monitor that made me a student-sized face, such that when a student asked a question, I would be able to look them in the eye. This is what it looks like from the student's point of view, and answer it while looking them directly in the eye. So what the students told me was the eye-to-eye contact is really what worked. Things like iPads or pre-recorded videos or things, they don't have that same ability to capture attention that looking someone in the eye does. And the fact that first of all, I do want to thank my department head, Professor Ann White, for just instantly approving this purchase. It was about $4,000 all in to build this thing. It was half from a kit, half homebrew. Took about an hour to set up, maybe a few hours to design. But you'll notice at points in the video, I actually look the viewer in the eye, and that captured people's attention. I did not water down the course one bit. We got through all the material at full force. I gave the students the same exams and problem sets, and they did a little bit objectively better, which made me realize that this mode of engagement, it's actually a little bit better than at the blackboard, because I never turned my back to the students. Something that didn't work out, though, that you may be able to see, or in fact you can't see, is notice my white shirt here. It took till about halfway through the semester to realize that what I wore would obscure the things at the board and make it so that students might have to jump forward in time to see what was written 15 minutes ago. So I tried my best to remedy that, and starting mid-semester, I started coming to class in a black shirt. And I want to show you what that looks like. So despite the fact that it's what the students called magician mode, because all you see is a head and hands and nothing else, it meant that I could write in front of me and have a fully immersive, better than Blackboard experience remotely. The questions flowed naturally the whole time. Students were engaged. They felt a sense of community, that they could actually ask each other questions, and I'd look them in the eye and answer those questions. And the teaching goal I met was to deliver an MIT quality educational product, despite the fact that we were remote. By all accounts, from the students' personal accounts, from the evaluations, from everything that happened before, it worked. And the side benefit is that now I have those lectures recorded. So this year I was able to flip the classroom and spend the time in class going over students' questions face to face. So instead of spending all the time with my back to them at the blackboard, I've offloaded that. Instead of reading, I have them watch the lecture videos, because let's be honest, nobody reads anymore. At least when I've interviewed my students from the last 7 years, the proportion who say they do the reading has gone down from about 80% to 20%. Extrapolating to this year, we'd hit 0, so I said, forget it. Watch the videos from last year, and I'll spend the whole hour working on problems with you, looking straight at you. And that, to me, is what made all the difference, is personal interaction at every possible opportunity. And I'll mention one last thing is I actually took a class during the pandemic on Zoom. I took Russian 1 from Maria Khatimsky, who also got one of these Digital Innovations Awards. And it allowed me to empathize with what the students were going through. So I could tell when things felt too fast, because I knew what it was like on the other end. I think I'll stop there to leave room for the rest of the panelists.
Fine. Thanks so much, Mike. Very, very, very interesting. Do we want to switch to Marcia's screen for just a minute? Just a quick capture. And up. There you go. Wait, this is last week's. There we go. Fabulous. So just take a minute and take a look at it.
Oh, this is nice. Thanks, Marcia.
Great. Wait till you see it all together. So that's fabulous. Thanks so much. So next up, we have Dr. Bruno Verdini. And Bruno?
Thank you, Janet. Of course, a pleasure. I mean, the video will capture the amount of smiles I shared as I was looking at Michael's work, and certainly it's always a delight to join my peers in discussing pedagogy, whether the journey is in person or online. Certainly in the negotiation field, the innovations we foster at MIT, they're really centered on a spirituality and a focus on your moral compass at the core of how we treat one another, how we communicate. And so when we were transitioning throughout the pandemic to teaching remotely, I could trust that we could meet the expectations of the students and the learning goals, in the sense that, you know, when you have classes as mine, which are electives, out of the 600 plus STEM students who pre-register for the 40 lottery spots that we allocate, I know they're going to put in their heart, regardless of the means of communication we rely upon. But there's an element to negotiation, a physicality to it, in the sense that it is not like in popular culture, a process of engaging in a boxing ring and trying to impose your will on one another. But well understood, negotiation leadership is much more as a dance. You have to understand the context and get into a rhythm and have a flow. And that melody, when we are in person in a classroom, the sounds, the reactions, the emotions of everyone are present, and they inform how you're navigating and responding to the role play simulations. When we are remotely, therefore, the responsibility was, if I'm in a rectangle box and the students are also, there's a whole part of our body that is lost. What is it that can be gained by being remotely? Well, that in practice, in real life, unless we have, as we do in some special occasions on campus, a filming crew ready to capture an entire negotiation, at least over Zoom, we can do so quite easily. And then you can play back quite quickly your tone, your demeanor, your behaviors. And like an athlete, watch the tape, and on the basis of it all, draw conclusions that in practice, in real life, we seldom do. And so, of course, the students discovered often that they say that they don't like their voice, how it sounds, that their voice suggests that they are vulnerable, afraid, and weak. And yet their peers, when they provide feedback looking at those videos, feel completely the opposite. Your voice is engaging, charismatic, trusting, true, honest. And so it was a great way to further reinforce the good ethical values that we're trying them to discover, that are already present in their heart, through the pedagogy that we foster in the field. And so that was the key transition when we went remotely, I'd say, in terms of manifesting the physicality in a different way by capturing it and allowing students to revisit their activities in a way that would be effective. And my experience, whether they graduate and go to work at JPL, or they decide to become diplomats or apply to law school, is that kernel of truth of negotiation as a journey to find what you stand for can be achieved in whichever situation we find ourselves, if the behaviors we model, we embody them. And as long as they do that, I always trust them to succeed in real life in their journey.
Fabulous. Thank you. Looking forward to your responses to the next set of questions, for sure. Marcia, can you share your screen? Terrific. Love it. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia. Thank you very much.
Wait till you see when it all comes together too. It's amazing. So fabulous. Thank you so much. So next up, we have Dr. Dimitra Dimitrakopoulou. And Dimitra, take it away.
Thank you, Janet, and thank you for the kind invitation. Just as a clarification, do we answer the first question only or all three?
The first three.
Okay, the first three. Okay. So when I was reflecting on the questions this week, I tried to think what was the innovation during the course that I taught last year together with Professor Aziza McDowell and Deb Roy. And actually the whole course was an innovation in itself. It was a course that we were teaching for the first time. It was the first time that the three of us were teaching together. So, and we had to do that during the pandemic. So everything felt to be a total innovative process in trying to come up with processes about how we interact with each other as the teaching team and with our teaching assistants, how we interact with the students, and how do we navigate the complexity and the uncertainty of a new course. So that meant that we had to design everything from scratch and also take into account all the different challenges that the pandemic itself posed to the teaching and learning process. What we try to do is to actually have the main concepts of the course. And let me remind you that the course that I'm referring to is called Constructive Communication Systems, Facilitated Dialogue, Technology and Design. So we actually build on the concepts, on the core concepts of the course to structure the whole process. And by that, I mean that we try to foster dialogue to connect with our students and engage in meaningful interactions and different reflective activities. We use design as a way to create the spaces for this dialogue to happen. And also we use technology to support our process. I want to share with you a couple of examples that we designed in order to help us feel connected as a community and keep our students and each other engaged into the teaching and the learning process. I'm going to share my screen and share a couple of examples. Of course, we all became aware of how much we are missing these in-person interactions and having the opportunity to get to know each other better besides everything that is discussed in the classroom. So one example is that we developed this board as a way for everyone to include some things about themselves, some information about their skill set or fun facts about themselves, and even try to make this a fun experience, a fun and engaging experience by inviting them to share their favorite snacks or their favorite music. And we try to incorporate some of these elements during our weekly classes. For example, every time we were starting with a song that one of the students or one member of the teaching team had put on that board, and we were inviting that person to share the backstory and start the course by making this a lighter and more engaging activity, and also have the opportunity to always go back to that board and read what people were writing about themselves, any updates that they were writing up there. Something else that we tried doing is use the visual element a lot during our classes. So we tried to translate the syllabus into these visual kind of library. So for example, we had all the readings for each week structured on that bookshelf, and the students were reflecting on the readings by submitting questions that they had, and this became part of the discussion that we were having during our meetings. Another space that we designed and that proved to be quite powerful is that we designed personal dashboards for each student. So every student had these digital sort of a notebook in which the purpose for that was to be like a one-stop place for them to be able to find everything that was needed for the class. Something that we found was very challenging, not for the students, but for us as well, is how to navigate between the different communication channels, the emails, the Slack channels, everything that we were using, the murals. And we found that it was a nice way to help students organize their work. We had specific templates that we were preparing each week to support the focus of our weekly class. And then the students were able to use that space to capture notes or anything that was relevant to them. And also, looking back, it became kind of a visual history of the course, because now we have all these inputs and materials from students that we can always reflect on and reflect back, but also use the knowledge that we captured with these opportunities to inform the way we will design and teach the course next year. So as I mentioned in the beginning, the purpose was to try to keep the students engaged. It was a small class, so fortunately we didn't have to deal with turned off cameras. So most of the times, most of the students were present, so that gave a lot of energy into the actual teaching and learning experience. But one of the objectives of the visual engagement that I shared with you was that we wanted to keep them engaged, interested, and very active, and create regular checking points, not from week to week, but also during the week, between the different classes taking place. I think that worked well. It served the objective that we tried to meet. Although I have to say that we were not really able to create that personal connection with the students. We always had to be proactive. These random interactions that happen with the students as you wait for the class to begin or after the class, we were missing that. We were moving from one Zoom meeting to the next. So we didn't really have that space. So we had to be very proactive in initiating one-on-ones with students and being always mindful of any students who could be struggling. So I think that was the challenge, and I think it will remain the challenge. And as far as this semester goes, this course actually will be taught next spring. So actually that gives us a little bit of breathing room to iterate on what we learned from last year. And hopefully the course will be then taught in person. So that would be another challenge of how do we move all of that from the digital space to the in-person world. And Janet, I think that's a signal that I'm running out of time. So I'll stop here.
Well, I think you're itching into the next set of questions. I wanted to make sure you saved something for the last part. So thank you. Here's Marcia's notes. Lovely. Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you so much. And so last but not least, we have Dr. Rea Lavi.
Thank you so much,
we
Anna.
will, after Rea is finished, we will take questions if you just want to raise your hand or write them in the chat. Great, Rea. Thank you.
So thank you, Janet TLL, for having me on to speak. Thank you, everyone who showed up to listen to us. I had the luxury of planning a new class, so planning it remotely to begin with. SP248 was a 1-unit first-year discovery class, which was really just about introducing first-year students to the NEET program. NEET program is a 3-year program that starts in the sophomore year, and it's project-centric and multidisciplinary. And what I wanted to do with this class was actually focus on thinking skills that cut across domains and that help with problem solving. So this in itself was kind of an innovation as a class, especially for students who are in their first year and first semester, let alone trying to do all of that remotely. So specifically to do with remote teaching, I would say that the two main innovations were, one, I made sure that over half of the activities were active learning. So there was a 50-minute lesson each week on Zoom, but there were also almost 2 hours of working at home, mainly in teams. And the idea was that even the Zoom lessons are at the most half me talking at the students, at the most. And a lot of using of online forums, breakout rooms, facilitations with other undergraduates from the NEET program, which really helped, or bringing in students from the NEET program to share their experiences and talk to students. So that was a very important thing. And another innovation I would say was this idea of multiple assessments. So using Google Forms and similar sort of tools, I did individual and team assessments, in class, out of class, formative and summative, and recognition, application, and reflection. All of this helped me to keep track of what is it that I've been successful at teaching, what is it that I've been less successful, and really kind of get down to brass tacks with regard to what is it exactly the students have understood and haven't understood. So I could give them more personalized feedback and so on. So that was quite helpful. Another thing I would say is that in order to allow all these assessments, I made sure that I used the same framework for teaching and assessing the same thinking skill. And I should say finally that what we did was, just to kind of clarify what it was that we were teaching, we took a case study from each one of the tracks at NEET. So a case study from autonomous machines, a case study from digital cities, renewable energy, and we taught a specific thinking skill through that case study. So for example, we taught systems thinking through renewable energy, looking at energy production systems and comparing them. So comparing a solar farm to a nuclear power plant, for example, and teaching students systems thinking through that. So that kind of answers question number one, I think. What need or teaching goal did this address? So there were 3 goals. The official goal in the syllabus was to provide students with basic concepts and practical tools for problem solving that will hopefully be relevant to them as they do projects at MIT and beyond. There was the goal for the program, which is we want to promote the program to these first years. We wanted to get excited about at least one of our tracks. And this is why I'm working together with the co-instructors every 2 weeks. A different instructor comes in from a different track. We bring in NEET students and so on. And we bring case studies from our program. And finally, an explicit objective for me was to innovate in undergraduate teaching. I wanted to teach a class that I would consider to some degree innovative, something that I haven't done before, or as far as I know in the field is something, at least something small that's new. So that was also an objective. In terms of what worked well and what didn't work so well. So in the fall class, I ended up having 54 students, which was highly unexpected and no one prepared me for. I was prepared for 10 or 15 students. And this was a lot. I would say it was too much to really give attention to even all the teams, because a lot of the work was done in teams, let alone all the individual students. In hindsight, which is always 20/20, I would have capped the class at 40. I think 40 is the maximum number, even in a classroom for this kind of class, because the students are not familiar with systems thinking and creative thinking and analytical thinking. They may have heard these names. They don't really know what they are. They're not really familiar with engineering either. So there's a lot that you need to go through and explain. In my spring class, I ended up having 12 students. And the reasons for me are still unknown. They're not found in subject evaluations as far as I know. They didn't hate the class. They quite liked it, most of them. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the first year discovery class and students tend to take them in the fall. And they may have had Zoom fatigue by the spring as well, because some of them could actually do other kind of classes. Another good thing that happened was the high submission rate, over 90% submission of assignments, which is very good for a first-year discovery class. There's no external motivation. It's not graded or anything like that. and they know that it's going to be very hard for me to fail anyone in this class. So that was good. I did make sure not to overburden them. Even though they had 2 hours to work at home, I made sure that most assignments would probably not take them that long. Students rarely ask questions beyond the lesson or assignment material, and they rarely stayed after the lesson. And this is something that is happening a lot more now when I'm teaching in the classroom. Maybe it also has something to do with the number of students. Quite a few students turned off their cameras during the lesson. I did make it clear that it's okay to turn them off, but I would prefer if they were on. But some of them did turn off their cameras. And just a couple of things. During the lessons, I would give them very short training assignments to train them how to use the form and how to follow the instructions for the team assignment, which they did at home. And this saved a ton of questions and confusion and misunderstandings. They always understood what they were supposed to do, even if this was an hour or an hour and a half long assignment for them to work for different people. They had it figured out because we spent 10 minutes working through it individually in the classroom. So that was very helpful. And as I already mentioned, the multiple assessments really helped. And in terms of how it's going this semester, Janet, should I talk about that as well briefly?
I think we can save that for the next part
Okay.
After the questions. So all set?
Yeah, that's it for me.
Okay, great. Thank you. So it's terrific. Let's take one more look at the graphic. And if you have some questions, there's a few questions in the chat, which we're going to try to address, but also feel free to raise your hand and I will call you in the order of appearance. Wonderful. So, watch the participants. Any, Dimitra, there was a question in the chat for your use of mural. Do you want to comment on that?
Yes, for sure. Is this the question
That Chris
shared
yes.
by Chris? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't that challenging. I think what was important is that we took a lot of effort and care into pre-designing all templates for the students. So that basically created a container in which the students could just go in there, and the only thing that they had to learn is to double click on a sticky note and just write, and then they had to just move things around. But most of the content that you saw was content that we created for the students so that we could address those challenges. We didn't want students to have the burden of having to learn like another tool, but rather make the tool and the platform work for them instead of the opposite.
Fabulous. And so if folks didn't see this, this was a question about the use of Mural, which is a wonderful software package that's available through MIT. We have another question in the chat for Bruno from Lourdes, asking if you taped the negotiations in person and then provided the videos, and just some more details about where the negotiations were performed.
Sure. Thank you, Janet, and thank you, Lourdes, for your thoughtful question. We certainly had already videotaped film negotiations of the varying set of role-play simulations that we run on a weekly basis. And we traditionally debrief those whether we're in person or remotely. But the innovation this time was when you were going through your own negotiation as a student, thoughtfully, not randomly, thoughtfully assign the roles and shape the groups that then would record in their own breakout rooms their negotiation, then create the space for reflection between the negotiation day and the debrief of that negotiation, where students could look at their film negotiation and revisit their actions. Certainly when we have a larger period of time, we can provide specific highlights with subtitles highlighting some of the best moves that we saw different actors put into practice. On this occasion, what we wanted the students to do is to be able to contrast how people in the very same role went about a different sequence or protocol to make a case, frame a subject, elicit trust, foster reciprocity, label concessions, and particularly create value across their negotiations. And in that sense, the immediacy of being able to look at the video while the experience is fresh that Zoom provides the moment you click on record and you stop it really empowers you to look at yourself from a different perspective, and as such perhaps polish or redefine what you thought you were conveying, right? You may think that you're someone who's engaging and loving, but your fear about a subject is coming across in the way you look at the camera. And so in a way, we also prepare them in the future when they'll go for interviews or they'll be interviewed by the media to really focus not on the mini box, but actually on the light in your computer, so that you connect and make an eye contact, as Michael actually was highlighting in his own presentation at the beginning.
Fabulous, thank you. And then we have a cross-cutting question from Michael Rutter that was in the chat. And Michael, do you want to just ask it? Because it's kind of a little long and nuanced. So Michael, are you there?
Sure, I'm here. Sorry. So I think my question was really about how much sort of learner expectation about the class format kind of influences the class. So if you know that the class is going to be online only, a learner is going to approach it very differently than if there's sort of the expectation that was in person, you had to kind of convert it. So I'm just wondering that if you knew that you had to design the class online only and had a lot more time and a lot more resources, what might you do differently? How might you think about it differently? And how do you think that kind of influences how learners think about it and engage it? Since what I heard a lot about remote learning, it was about sort of trying to make up the differential or learners missing what they had before. But if that wasn't a factor, how might you think about it then? And I know that's a little bit of a muddy question. So Janet, if you can reframe it, feel free.
Well, I'm going to let everybody answer. I see Mike has his hand up, but I think it actually is a nice, it intersects nicely with the next two questions, actually, which are, how's it going now, and and what do you see for the future? Which I think brings in this idea that, okay, now you've taken something, it's an in-class, it's an in-person experience, and how are you kind of changing both how you manage student expectations and then also how you implement what it was you were doing before. So maybe if we could merge them all together and start with Mike.
Sure, yeah, thanks for the question, Michael. And I've got two answers that I guess maybe a facet to add to your question. That would depend to me on whether the class is going to be synchronous or self-paced. So for example, with the Lightboard stuff that I did, I had not heard, or no one else I talked to had heard of doing synchronous Lightboard classes, because this was something where you pre-recorded it and then diced it up into manageable pieces. So if this was going to be a self-paced version, I think it's important to break up the lectures or whatever content delivery into really small segments, like is done at edX and MITx, which lets the learner take a break and digest and reflect on the material rather than go through an hour and a half and just say, oh my gosh, what just happened? I've got to rewatch it a whole bunch of times. If it's synchronous, however, then that totally changes the game. And that's what I found in this past year, where it's going to be really important to make sure that even though you're not talking to a crowd of people and you can't necessarily see their reactions, you've got to find a way to gauge the audience and tell whether or not they're getting it or not. And just asking, are there any questions, I found didn't work. In fact, the thing I spent the most time doing in prepping for this year's class, where I used the recordings from last year, is cutting out the 30 seconds of silence every time I asked, are there any questions? That didn't work. And so if you're going to offer it synchronously online, finding a way to engage and actually get people to speak up, or finding ways of audience engagement is critical that you'd be missing from in person. And if it's self-paced, I think dicing it up into manageable pieces to facilitate self-learning and reflection at every possible opportunity is how I go about it.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else want to jump in and sort of do the sort of kind of looking ahead, but also thinking about this, just sort of the fundamental difference between the way students perceive or approach an online class versus a in-person class? Dimitra.
Thank you, Janet. Some thoughts on this. When we first started teaching this course last semester, I think most of us were thinking, okay, we love in-person learning, and now we have to do that online. So how can we make this work best? But I think what we realized is that there are a lot of best practices that we can learn from teaching online. And actually, the one can complement the other, instead of having like an entire in-person course being substituted by something that is taught online and vice versa. So I think, as linking that with the question, how does the future look like? I think what my personal goal is to take those best practices from the remote teaching and use them as a way to inform the teaching that potentially could happen in person, or maybe it's a hybrid. But I think many of the things that many of the examples that I shared with you could be very well support the in-person learning, and then still provide the opportunity for students to have more spaces to experiment with and be creative.
Mhm. Great, thank you. I saw Rea with this. Yeah, go ahead, Rea.
Hi. Am I muted, by the way? The notification has been a bit weird. I'm not. Okay, great. So I would like to say that I actually think that planning for a remote course gives one the opportunity to really focus on active learning, because you're kind of very worried that students won't be engaged. So you can kind of bake it into the lesson plan. And I've definitely carried that forward into my classroom teaching, because even in the classroom, students have their laptops in front of them and they have their phones on the desk, and we don't know what they're doing. We can probably make a pretty accurate guess, but if they actually spend some of that time doing active learning, whether they're sitting in a team working through something, or they're filling out a form, or they're looking at a video, or whatever that is, you at least know they're spending that time doing what you want them to do. So I found that very useful. And just building on what Mike was talking about with those 30 awkward seconds and so forth, the use of things like polls or individual forms like the ones that I'm using and so on is one way of testing whether students have understood the material without asking them directly, or looking for those usual suspects, those 3 or 4 or 5 students that are always engaged and are always engaged with the lecture, and the other ones are kind of just sitting back, and you just don't know whether they've understood or not. So I think that the idea of remote teaching, if you are looking at it top down, you're looking at what are my objectives and now how am I going to achieve them through as much active learning as possible. And it does depend on the course and on the domain. There's no doubt about that. There's no one solution that fits all. But generally speaking, if you can have students spend the lesson time engaged in some kind of active learning, then you can collect the data and see whether they've actually understood the material or not. I think that can be really helpful. And there's a lot of different ways to do that.
Fabulous, thank you. And Bruno, you haven't chimed in on these particular points.
Thank you, Janet. I think I would be relatively brief in terms of highlighting 2 elements as we return certainly to this vision of what can we do moving forward. When we were teaching all the time over Zoom, I wanted to focus on a particular part of our bodies, our eyes, how tired they might be from the amount of time spent in front of a screen. Unfortunately, that in-person trainings on campus, part of the rules in negotiation is that nobody can bring any electronics into our class, and the students lovingly appreciate that commitment because they understand that in negotiation, you're responsible for a co-created outcome. So the lack of presence or focus on the body language of your peer might impact negatively your absence of preparation, the experience that they have. And so you have a responsibility toward your peer in the learning. And if you want to be present, you better embrace it. And I celebrate that students do it. When you are remotely, therefore, and you add all the classes that they were looking at from their homes, I wanted to make sure that many of the key stories that we deliver would come through a different medium, and that was through podcasts. I wanted them to be in situations where, if their situation allowed it, they could go on walks and listen. Okay, I'm framing creativity in negotiation. Let's do it for a 15-minute interview of Sting, talking about in his career how he's revisited his own songs to approach them with creativity. And through that interview, Sting wonderfully will express a whole host of values associated with humility, reciprocity, and love that I think can linger. And as we now return in person, those podcasts play the same role when you're just trying to navigate a tough week of PSETs. As you're going to bed, I already see them in their weekly reflection journals, their students choosing literally quotes from this podcast to be part of their reflections. And so, that's what I can share on this front, dear Janet.
Fabulous. Thank you. Something that I thought of when Mike was speaking, but I feel like all of you have sort of touched upon it. This idea that, sort of data, if you will, is ubiquitous, right? So why would students come to class if they could look it up on the internet or they could watch a video or something? And so somebody had talked to me once about this idea of data, information, and then knowledge. And the fact that what we do in our classrooms, or what you all do in your classrooms, is to try to help students create knowledge, right? Come to understandings, create knowledge. And I think you've all really shown how some of the things that you did during the pandemic, that you were really purposeful in making sure that that's what happened, that knowledge creation, where students really had to engage with the material in different ways. And, even the things about, really analyzing their negotiations, like really analyzing it, not just thinking about it, but seeing it and thinking about it, or seeing the equations as they evolve, and having to think about it and maybe answer questions about it. And then, the idea of shared documents that are kind of co-created. And all these things seem to be so rich in the knowledge creation category that I'm just really impressed by it all. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I got to add, I'm super impressed by the murals thing. It is certainly complex looking, I guess, from first glance, but it looks like it's been a tremendous boost to what Dimitra is doing. So thanks for sharing that.
Fabulous. Can we take another look at the graphic notes as another form of visual information? So I'm just going to be quiet for just 30 seconds while we all look at this. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we're pretty close to on time, on MIT time, but I'm going to ask the panelists, assuming everybody's okay, if we have additional questions, folks can reach out to you, more information about your use of Mural, Dimitra, or the Lightboard, Mike, or using these videos, or the idea of really thoughtful, aligned assessments. There's so much more we could learn, and I'm sure that a lot of us have additional questions. So hopefully you're open to getting a few emails from the MIT community.
Absolutely, yeah. If anyone wants to try the Lightboard too, we're setting it up in the ESG space. So it's anyone who wants to try it, come on over.
And I'll just put a link to the syllabus of my class in the chat. Anyone is interested in checking it out, and my email is always open.
Excellent. I don't see any more questions or any more hands raised. And we have about a minute left before it's 5 of the hour. So I just want to thank our panelists again. Really fascinating, interesting, thought-provoking, and we really appreciate your time. So thanks very much. And again, check out the TLL website in the coming months or so as we roll out more videos and more interviews with MIT faculty and instructors about all the wonderful things they've been doing. Thank you so much.
Thanks to you, Janet, and Kate and Brian, and for the dignity and passion with which you lead innovation in pedagogy on our campus. It comes across in everything you do. Thanks so much, too.
Yeah, I'd like to second that.
Um,
I find myself referring colleagues to the TLL exponentially more with every coming month. Since you guys have been the one-stop shop, not just for best practices, but sort of all of us upping our game in many ways and interconnections between us who want to do so. So thank you guys.
Thank you. You guys are the lifeblood. So
Thank you so much for that.
thanks so much. Thanks for coming, everyone. Don't forget our next seminar, in the speaker series, October 26th, Dr. Mezamad, talking about trauma-informed pedagogy. And please reach out to any of us if you have any questions about teaching and learning at MIT.